Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on teaching with cases. I'm Melissa Close. I'm the Cases Commissioning Lead here at Emerald Publishing, based out of Boston. And we are joined by Dr. Sarah Holtzen, who's going to be talking about the different ways you can better use the case method in your classroom and why this is such an impactful way of teaching. So I'm just going to go ahead and get started with a little bit of housekeeping. So Emerald uses GoToWebinar for events such as this, and you will notice that you have a control panel, usually on the right-hand side of your screen, that will allow you to change different settings. So first, you can change your speakers if you're having any difficulties hearing the audio from today's webinar. You can play around with this until hopefully it sorts itself out if you can't currently hear. You would also note that today you'll be muted for the entire event, but you do have access to a question and answer and a chat bar where you can send in any comments or questions to our speaker. We will have a Q&A section at the end of today's presentation, so feel free to send these in throughout, and we will get to them at the end. And then finally, I'm just going to note that this session will be recorded, and the recording will be distributed via email, whichever you have registered under, about 2 or so hours after the session has concluded. So with the housekeeping out of the way, I'm going to run through a quick agenda. So first, I'm going to walk through a brief introduction to the Emerald Case Collection. I will then hand over to Dr. Sarah Holtzen for her presentation on teaching with cases, followed by that Q&A. So to begin, Emerald Publishing is a true supporter of the case method because we believe in its ability to create real-world impact both inside and outside of the classroom, primarily through the research that these authors conduct with organizations in order to write case studies, and also in their ability to engage and inspire students and to instill with them key learnings and competencies that they will take into their future careers. So Emerald has nearly 3,000 case studies published in a diverse array of subjects. We seek to empower students with relevant and timely material, and to do that, we publish in a number of areas on different trends and also backgrounds. So it's very important for us that our case collection be diverse, and we publish a number of competitions, such as an annual Case for Women competition, special issues on different regions, demographics, that will provide students with the opportunity to see themselves reflected in our case protagonists. And we publish in the full spectrum of business and management topics, from accounting to marketing, HR, and beyond. Today's webinar is partnered with the Case Journal, which is the official journal of the Case Association that seeks to present students with a modern interpretation of this discussion-based teaching. If you're unfamiliar with the Case Journal, it's a very rigorous publication. It is double-blind, peer-reviewed, Scopus indexed, and it publishes about 66 cases per year in a wide spectrum of topics. We publish compact cases, which for us are around 1,000 to 3,000 words, and also traditional length cases, which can be anywhere up to 7,000 words. So whatever you're looking for in terms of size and scale for your students, it probably has something in TCJ that will work for you. If you're interested in submitting case studies, I will also note that we do have a number of benefits for the authors who work with us. We offer payment upon publication. We distribute globally and help with promotion of the case following publication, and we also have competitive acceptance rates. And I will share these slides after this presentation so that you can refer to this material later on. On the note of authorship, and also as a interesting point for if you're looking for cases featuring diverse protagonists, I wanted to mention the upcoming deadlines for our annual Case for Women competition. All of these outputs are published in TCJ as a special issue, and they seek cases that have a female protagonist who has to face some kind of real-world business dilemma. So if you are working on a case such as this, you're welcome to contribute and have a chance to win a significant prize fund. I think the top case gets about $5,000, and the submission deadline for this is going to be the 30th of April in 2025. So still plenty of time to work on your case. And if you're not a case author, you're just looking for cases to use, this is available on our website, and you can see all the cases we've published over the last few years from the case for women. Then finally, this will be my last slide before I introduce Sarah. I just wanted to share some resources that Emerald has available for those who are inclined towards authorship. So we have a number of guides on how to write teaching cases. We also have the Emerald Cases Hub, which is where we house all of our past webinars, sample cases, and written materials that will help you successfully publish. We also have some books available for purchase on our bookstore, such as the Compact Guide to Compact Cases, which contains helpful roadmaps, infographics, example cases to help you write in that more concise format, because it does have its own unique challenges to write so shortly. And then finally, I've included my contact information in case you'd like to reach out afterwards with any questions. So with that slide complete, I'm just going to read off Sarah's bio and then hand over for her presentation. So Dr. Sarah Holtzen, Ph.D., is a passionate case researcher and educator. She has been an active member of the Case Association since participating in the 2020 edition of the Case Hackathon event, where she first fell in love with case writing and teaching. Since that time, Sarah has participated in a variety of leadership roles within CASE, including conference reviewer, roundtable facilitator, and 2 terms as secretary from 2022 to 2026. As an active case writer with the most supportive co-authors, Sarah enjoys publishing regularly in the Case Journal. In 2023, her co-authored case on Citigroup's corporate activism in relation to reproductive rights was selected as the second place case for the Case for Women competition, sponsored by Emerald and the Forte Foundation and MBA Roundtable. Sarah also serves as an assistant professor of management and graduate programs coordinator for the Robert W. Plaster School of Business at Missouri Southern State. And with that, Sarah, I will hand over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Melissa, and hello, y'all. I'm Sarah, and as Melissa mentioned, I am relatively new to the case method. I first learned how to write cases back in 2020, but I have absolutely fallen in love with it as a research method, as an educational tool, and really as a community, which is something that I want to emphasize to everyone on the call today. There are so many opportunities to get involved, whether it be through the Case Association, the Case Journal. There are lots of organizations and opportunities to really embed yourself in this community of scholars, because one thing that I've learned over the past several years is that it really is a community. It's supportive, it's engaging, and I hope I can convince you all of the same. So let's go ahead and take a look. Melissa, if you could click to the next slide, and we'll look at a quick overview for today. So when Melissa originally reached out, and I do need to start by saying thank you to Melissa and Emerald Publishing for inviting me to speak to you all in today's webinar. It is a true honor. And she asked me to talk about 4 different topics. So today we're going to look at how to select the best cases for your course. I think that's oftentimes one of the hardest things. There's lots of great cases out there. And how do I find the one that's really going to work for my purposes and speak to my students? The second topic that we're going to talk about is how we prepare for the lesson. And I framed this a couple of different ways, thinking about how to prepare your students, but then also how to prepare yourself, because there is a bit of self-preparation that's required. The third topic that we're going to look at is engaging with students. So I've got a couple of different tips on how to really elevate your case teaching. I think if you've ever taught with cases, you've probably experienced the excitement that it generates in the classroom when students really get involved in that discussion. But I do have a few more tips to share with you. I will close things out by looking at ways that we can encourage deeper thinking, not only in our case teaching, but again, I'm hoping I can stimulate a little bit of thought around getting involved in the case community. All right, Melissa, ready for the next slide? All right, so up first, you've decided that you want to use a case in your classroom. And so of course you need to pick a case, which sounds relatively simple, right? For example, I teach HR. So I would need to go find an HR case. It is much more difficult than that though, and I really feel like picking the right case, not only for your students, but also for you as an educator, is critically important. And so I've broken it down here into 4 different steps. Step 1 is ask yourself, what are your learning objectives? The case that you pick should always speak to those learning objectives. And so this should really be your foundation for the case that you ultimately choose. What do you want students to know or be able to do or leave your classroom with once you have had this case discussion? The second thing that you need to think about in addition to learning objectives is, where do these objectives fit in my overall course placement? So I think we all have different preferences surrounding the order in which we want to teach material. Sometimes we're bound to very prescriptive rules in the order that we can teach them. But you want to make sure that wherever you decide to sequence this case within your course, that the concepts that students are going to need to understand for the case have already been taught. So you'll often notice if you're getting a teaching note or an instructor's manual, if you're getting a case from the case journal, they all include those. You will often see a little recommendation for where or how to position the case according to the topics that have been covered. So once you've decided what you want students to leave your classroom with and where this is going to fit sort of in your overall semester plan, the second thing that you need to think about is how you're going to use the case. And there are several different ways that you could leverage a case in the classroom. So the first is perhaps the most traditional, just a one-off assignment. I prepare my students for the case, we come in, we have a nice discussion, and perhaps they submit answers to discussion questions or some other way that I measure their engagement. But there are other ways that you can use a case. So one of the most interesting that I'm seeing right now is faculty who are using cases as a take-home exam. I know one of the things that we're all worried about in 2024 is the influx of generative AI. And I'm going to tell you today that case studies are one of the most AI-proof methods that you can bring into the classroom if done correctly. So with a take-home exam, you can give students a case that they take home with them and perhaps record a video deliverable or write the answers to the discussion questions. But these cases can often be smaller in length as opposed to the longer cases that you might use for a full classroom discussion. The third option there, if you want to get really fancy, is you could leverage a case as a semester-long project. We'll talk here in a few minutes about some of the different formats that are available for cases today. But as Melissa was mentioning, there's everything from a compact 1,000 word case all the way up to those more traditional 10 and 12 pagers that we're used to seeing. So you could potentially give your students one of those longer cases and have them work on it throughout the semester as a project. Now, once we've thought about those two pieces, on the other side of the screen, it's really time to start thinking about who are your students, but then also who are you? So when you're thinking about students and what case to pick, there are a couple of things to consider. First, what are your students' level of preparedness? Are you teaching a foundation level class that has no prereqs, or are you teaching the senior capstone course in your discipline where students are expected to be able to leverage all of that foundational knowledge? Depending on the type of class you're teaching and the level of preparedness that you can expect from your students, you can pick a different type of case. So for example, I might pick a more complex case for my seniors as opposed to a more introductory case for my foundation students. Now, the second thing that you need to consider with students is the topic relevancy. So I don't know about your all students, but my students are sometimes not big on reading. And I found that one of the ways to get them to read is by assigning a case that has a topic that is particularly relevant to them. So I think there's a reason that we see so many cases on popular companies and popular protagonists, because it's really something that students can connect with. But that third bullet point, geographic location. So depending on where your institution is located and the type of students that you're teaching, different businesses and different topics are going to be more germane to the topic of conversation. So the example that I have here before I talk about course modality, I have a quick picture of some coffee beans. And this is an example that I use. So one of the cases that I use in class is a case about Starbucks during Black Lives Matter in the summer of 2020 and an employee handbook issue that they were dealing with at the time. So for my students, this was a very relevant topic because it had just happened. At my institution, it worked well in terms of our students love to drink coffee. And so it was a topic that they could very quickly connect to. And then the last thing that you need to consider here is, are you teaching these students in the traditional classroom space, or as more and more of us are being asked to do, teaching either in an online environment or perhaps even one of those hybrid modalities where you're expected to keep the attention of students not only in the classroom, but also somehow manage those Zoom breakout rooms that we all know and love. So once you've thought about who your students are and really reflected on what you can expect from them, the last thing that I would encourage you to think about is, who are you? And this might seem a little counterintuitive because cases are very student driven and discussion based, but I found that the more comfortable that you are with the case that you've selected, and the more that you can stand behind it and really feel confident that you know the topic, and that you're going to be able to leverage this successfully, the better results that you'll have. So this can be as simple as stepping back and thinking about your own strengths and weaknesses. What are the things that you like doing in the classroom? What are the topics that you enjoy talking about? And then conversely, what are those things in the classroom that perhaps you shy away from? For me, it's role play. And what are the things that you do well? Once we've thought about our strengths and weaknesses, also think about your overall teaching philosophy. So are you one of those educators who really likes to kind of take center stage and drive the bus down the road? Or are you one of those people who likes to sit in the back seat and really let students kind of tease these things out? So all four of these are going to help you select a case. And then Melissa, if you could click to the next slide, we're going to look briefly at the different case formats that are available. So over on the left-hand side, there are lots of different types of cases. And that first one is perhaps the one that most folks are the most familiar with, kind of that classic decision-focused case where the protagonist, the case ends with the decision that the person is needing to make. There's often a sense of urgency with that decision, and students are very frequently placed in the shoes of the protagonist and essentially asked, would you choose course of action A or B? However, we also have different formats of cases. So there are illustrative cases that are simply used to illustrate a situation that occurred. We also have descriptive cases, which we can use to teach students how a specific issue was handled. So as opposed to letting them make the decision, here the decision has already been made and we're just kind of describing it. The last type of case that you'll see are what we call analytical cases, and these are focused on getting students to solve a specific problem. So you will often see these types of cases in the more quantitative numbers-based courses. Once you've thought about the type of case that you want, on that bottom right-hand side, you also have lots of opportunity available to pick a case that works for your classroom, your students, the amount of time that you have, and again, your overall goals with the learning objectives. So of course, there are those traditional length cases that most of us think about, several pages of reading that require quite a bit of preparation. But more and more, we're starting to see compact cases. And compact cases are actually where I started learning how to case write. And as a result of that, I bring them into my classroom a lot. My students enjoy compact cases because I can print them off, stand outside of the door, and hand them to students as they walk in for class. So I don't ever have to worry, has half of the class maybe not read the case, which sometimes happens. So compact cases are a great way to make sure that students have a chance to read the case material without any pre-work. And then we are starting to see more multimedia and other methods of cases. So I've seen cases in the form of a comic book style. I've seen cases that have video clips embedded in them. And I've even recently started to see cases that have been created on Canva and similar platforms to incorporate graphics that are easier for students to read. All right, Melissa, next slide. So now that we've thought about how to select the best case for your course, so now you've got your case picked, you've decided where you want to position it in your class. And so the next thing that you need to start thinking about is how you're going to prepare for the case lesson. And so kind of broadly speaking, you need to first develop your teaching plan or your overall strategy for how you're going to approach the case discussion. And again, you have several options here. So you could just go rogue and create your own. I'll do this a lot of times if I have a case and maybe don't have access to the instructor's manual or the teaching note, and I will decide what I want my teaching strategy to be and kind of think about the learning objectives that I want to leverage through that case. Now, of course, if you are getting a case from, for example, the case journal or one of Emerald's other outlets, they will come with an instructor's manual. And I think the beauty of an instructor's manual is it really gives you a path-by-path breakdown of the case, not just the suggested answers to discussion questions, but oftentimes you'll find cases today that have very detailed teaching plans broken down into chunks of time that you can follow to make sure that you're hitting your different learning objectives. And then, of course, you could blend those two. So maybe you find a case and you like the instructor's manual or part of it, but you maybe see it going a different direction in your classroom. Feel free to blend those two elements. You don't have to follow the instructor's manual down to the T. One of the things I've heard recently, there is no instructor's manual police, right? So they're not going to come find you if you do not follow every single step in the manual. You can feel a little bit of freedom to deviate from that. But I will say when I was just getting started with case teaching, it was very comforting to me to have a nice, robust instructor's manual that I knew was going to give me a roadmap for where I wanted to go. Now, in addition to thinking about your teaching plan, another thing that you want to think about is how you're going to assess students, right? At the end of the day, the case is being incorporated in your classroom for a pedagogical purpose, and so you need to figure out how you're going to measure whether or not students achieve the learning objectives that you set out to achieve with the case. And so again, a couple of different things to think about here. The first, what type of deliverable are you going to require? And some of this is going to be dictated by the course modality that you're teaching. If you're in an in-person class, then you could do things in person. If you're online, then it's much more likely that you're going to need a written or perhaps a video deliverable. Again, kind of tying things back into this ongoing conversation about the influence of AI in our classrooms, I will tell you that cases combined with a video deliverable has worked really well for me. So I have students, instead of answering the discussion questions in a written format, they use Microsoft Teams to just record a video deliverable of themselves answering the questions. So their face is visible, I can see them, I can verify it's actually them saying the information and not ChatGPT. And so it works really well for different types of deliverables. Also thinking about whether you want students to work in teams or individually. So again, this is going to be shaped by the type of institution that you're at and the number of students that are in your class. I'm at a very small teaching institution where we cap our classes at 35 students max. So I'm able to do a lot of individual work in those parameters. If you're at one of those schools that maybe have 500, 600, 700 or more students per section, then you might want to think about leveraging team deliverables. But just because you have a very large or a very small classroom certainly does not preclude you from adopting cases into your pedagogical tool belt. Other activities to think about. So I mentioned that role play is one that I shy away from, but it's also one that when I do use it in my classroom in conjunction with cases, it really gets students excited. I can assign students to different roles, maybe the protagonist and the person that they're making a decision for or against, and really have them kind of talk these things out in a safe environment in the classroom. You can also do things like board plans, so splitting the board up into different sections, assigning the students into teams and handling different pieces of the case. And then of course, there are other pedagogical tools, things like a fishbowl, where you bring 1 or 2 students up to the front engaged in a role play and have the rest of the class kind of observe and then provide feedback on that experience. The last piece here, so I cannot say enough good things about the instructor's manuals that I've seen coming out of the case journal. They include everything from role play activities to board plans, to even worksheet templates. So things that you can hand out in class that will help your students work through the case material are all available to you in the instructor's manual. So once we've prepared for the lesson, this next slide is going to look at how we prepare our students for the case discussion. And so the first thing that you'll need to assess here is, have your students ever done a case before? Sometimes when I'm teaching, I will have a group of students who are very experienced in using cases in the classroom. The very next semester, I might have students who have no idea what I mean when I talk about a case. So one of the tips that I've picked up from other case writers is you can actually use a practice case. So a very short case, maybe one from the back of a textbook, those little ones that are just a couple of paragraphs long, but you can use those to walk through students and show them the actual case process. So this is how we read the case. We're going to answer discussion questions. You can walk them through how to identify the protagonist, what the decision is that needs to be made. And then that way, when they show up for the actual real case, they know what they're doing and feel confident and able to succeed. The second thing that you want to think about is how you're going to frame the discussion. So case teaching is, at the end of the day, really a discussion-based pedagogy. We're expecting students to read the case and then show up to class ready and prepared to talk about the information contained within that. So when you get students involved in a discussion, hopefully they're going to be an engaged and excited group. And so you want to make sure that you prepare up front by really setting the guidelines before class starts. So simple things like letting students know, are you required to raise your hand if you want to make a contribution? Or can you simply interject when another person is speaking? And some of these things might sound counterintuitive, but I've discovered that if you really take time to lay the groundwork before you dive into the case, it results in a much more positive experience for everyone involved. You also want to make sure that you explain what participation looks like. So this is one thing that students struggle with a little bit when leveraging cases in the classroom, is what do I need to do to earn the points, right? How do I participate? Do I need to ask one question? Do I need to raise my hand? Do I need to just give an answer? Do I need to talk for a certain amount of time? And so I think explaining to students how you're going to measure participation can be very helpful. And there are several different ways to do this. So you could start by taking attendance and then using a system, for example, where you do a plus and a minus mark to evaluate students' participation based on whether or not they were in class that day. I've also seen some instructors get fancier. You could have a rubric that very clearly spells out exactly what participation looks like. And then you could go even further and perhaps require a certain number of responses or a certain level of engagement for students. The third element here, and this really takes place before students ever set foot in the classroom, is making sure that they've completed the required pre-work. Experience has taught me that if all you do is ask the students to read the case, there is a very good chance that at least some students are going to show up to your class having not read the case, which makes it difficult to really get the full benefit of the case method. So assign something and also make it worth points. Again, attach points to it so students will actually do it. But this can be something as simple as having them perform some basic research on the company. They could take a self-assessment. So depending on the topic that you're going to be talking about, maybe they could take a quiz and see where they stand on this issue. And then of course, really reiterate that they do need to read the case before they come to class. One tip that I have picked up recently to help check if students have been reading the cases, so maybe you've assigned a case and your students are showing up unprepared and you have a sneaking suspicion that they aren't reading, you could ask them to do a quick little quiz and answer a very basic question like, what is the name of the company that this case is over? Or what is the protagonist's name? What is their decision? Something very basic to try to test if the students have been reading. But again, this is the beauty of compact cases. So if you've never tried a compact case in class, I would encourage you to give it a go, because the beauty here is you never have to worry about whether or not students have read the case ahead of time. You just hand it to them as they walk in the door to your classroom and let them read it in the first 5 minutes as everyone is getting settled. All righty, Melissa, ready for the next slide? All right, so once you've prepared your students, then of course you need to prepare yourself and get ready for the case discussion. So again, going back to the learning objectives, that's something I always ask myself really at any time in the classroom is what's my goal today? What am I trying to get students to leave with? And so I would encourage you to think back to those learning objectives that you set out as the way to pick your case. The next thing that you want to think about, and this ties in a bit to your teaching philosophy, but set the right frame of mind. So I think one of the beauties of the case method as a pedagogical tool is it's really quite different from the traditional lecture format that most students are exposed to. So the way that I've had this explained to me is traditionally we're all used to that sage on the stage, right? The professor gets up, they lecture poetically for an hour or so, and then disappear back into their office. Case teaching is much different. So in case teaching, we say that we are the guide on the side. So you are not the star of the case, right? That is the protagonist's job. But case teaching is really driven by students, which seems a little bit counterintuitive and I think can be a little bit scary. But again, it's all about staying focused on your learning objectives. So I was at a conference last week and I picked up this analogy of a river, and I think that it really describes well kind of the frame of mind that I try to use when I approach teaching a case. And so I wanted to share it here with you too. So a river is going to wind and we're going to go off path. We might stop and pull our boat over and get out and explore for a little bit. But at the end of the day, we need to make sure that we're back in the boat and moving down the river. So the more that we can identify the different guideposts that we should be hitting during the case discussion, the more we're going to make sure that we can stay on the course of the river while still allowing students to deviate and have interesting conversations. Speaking of interesting conversations, case teaching sometimes has unexpected outcomes, and they can be great, right? This is oftentimes when students learn best, is when there's tension or disagreement or excitement to the point that students are starting to raise their voice to make sure that they get heard. So when you do run into situations like this, and I'll give you a quick example, one of my favorite cases to use is a TCJ case in the case journal, and it is about the US women's soccer team and their pay discrimination lawsuit that was filed back in 2018. And this was a case that I used for the first time, I think about a year or so ago. And at my institution, it can sometimes be hard to get the student athletes to engage in the classroom. And I was so surprised that with this case, I had students sitting in the back that I had never heard from all semester. This was like week 10, and I had never heard them contribute without forcing it out of them. And suddenly they were standing up. They were not shouting, but they were having a really passionate discussion about this issue because, again, it was a topic that was relevant for that group of students. As a case teacher, it caught me a bit off guard. I wasn't expecting this case to generate quite that much interest among that population. And so I think it's important to be able to recognize engagement when it's happening and nurture it to a certain point, but you also want to be able to balance that with guidance. So in this instance, I eventually did have to pull the students back to the case learning objectives because they were just so engaged in the conversation and the setup for this case. That it was creating this atmosphere of excitement, which I just love. A good IM. So hopefully this is one of the things that you've noticed I keep coming back to today. There are lots of case outlets out there, lots of great places to find cases, but I will say that one of the values of Emerald and the case journal is that you know that you're getting a very robust IM. So the instructor's manuals that I get from the case journal, if the case is covering a topic, for example, the Starbucks case and Black Lives Matter, that was a very heated topic of discussion. The instructor's manual gave very specific guidelines on here is a portion of the case discussion where things might get heated. Here is a way that you might handle that. And so I would encourage you to look for case outlets that do include a robust instructor's manual, especially if you're early on in your case teaching endeavors. All right, I think I'm ready for the next slide, Melissa. So we've picked our case, we've prepared, we've made sure that students are ready, we've made sure that we ourselves are ready, and now comes the fun part. So these last two sections of today's webinar, I'd like to focus on how to engage with students and also how to think about encouraging deeper thinking. So I mentioned a couple of slides ago that it's important to think about your teaching philosophy. It's also important to think about the role that you play in the classroom in creating and sustaining an active learning environment. So I found that the more that you can really set the stage for the case, build some tension, some urgency, really get students invested in the decision or the situation that's being examined, the more impactful of a case learning experience your students are going to have. So what's your hook? We say in a good case that there should be an opening and a closing hook, right? Something that keeps me reading, and then something at the end of the case that makes me want to sit down and solve this decision that the protagonist was facing. So building tension comes along with setting the hook. Why does this decision need to be made by the protagonist? Why is it so important? Why does the decision need to be made quickly? And so a couple of recommendations here that I found helpful for setting the stage and building tension. If it's a current event, you can show a news clip to really situate students in the case setting. And again, a good instructor's manual will often provide links and recommended videos for doing just that. You could get students started with a board activity. So if you're using a decision-focused case, there are usually going to be 2 courses of action that students could pursue when they're wearing the shoes of the protagonist. And so you might simply split the class into 2 different groups and have one group write down on one side of the board all of the arguments for this, and the other group write down all of the arguments for the other course of action. Splitting the class into multiple groups or 2 sides also works well, kind of depending on the topic of the case and what you're looking at. But again, the more that you can situate students and get them ready and excited about the case, I think the better experience that you're going to have overall. You can also encourage deeper discussion by assigning roles. So sometimes, and again, this is going to vary depending on the size of your class, but you could assign individual roles. So telling a student that they are going to be the facilitator for a roundtable discussion. You could have certain students serve as note takers, so being responsible for tracking their team's involvement and the discussions that are had, and then breaking them out to share with the class. One of my favorite things to do during a case is think, pair, share, which I'm sure folks have heard of on the call, but I don't think we always think about using it in a case setting. But asking students to think individually, pair them off with another person, and then the share piece comes when they share their conversation with the rest of the class. So this can be really fun for exploring different points of view, and again, helping to set the stage for the rest of the case conversation. The last little piece, so leveraging technology or not. I think one of the most beautiful things about case teaching is that it's really adaptable to who you are as an educator and what you want your students to achieve. So if you're one of those folks that leans really heavy into ed tech, maybe you're already folding AI into your classroom and you're using all of the latest technology available, then go wild, fold that in with your case. I've used things like Top Hat to do word clouds. I've used voting platforms to allow students to vote. But if you're comfortable with technology, don't be afraid to fold that in as a way to engage students even further in the case method. Similarly, if you do not want to fold technology in, that is totally cool too with case methods, which I think is one of the most beautiful things about using it as a teaching tool. At the end of the day, all that you really need to teach a case is just the case. So fold technology in if you want or don't. All right, Melissa, next slide. All right, so as we wind things down, I did want to talk a little bit about how we can encourage deeper thinking. So cases are already a good way to get students engaged, but there are ways that we can go deeper. So again, keeping your focus on the learning objectives and also on the type of students that you have, what are some things that you can do to cultivate psychological safety? So I've discovered that when teaching cases, once the conversation gets going, it's oftentimes hard to stop it, but it can be really hard to get it going for certain groups of students. So one tactic that I've adopted is a warm call versus a cold call. So cold calls are, again, kind of that traditional lecture environment where the professor sees you not paying attention and asks you a question and puts you on the spot. And it can create an environment where students feel uncomfortable and not able to voice their opinion. So one of the strategies that I've adopted is instead a warm call. So I will sometimes tell my class as they're reading the compact case, get ready, because at the start of this case, each of you is going to answer this same question, and I'm going to call on every single person in this room rapid fire to answer it. So I'm giving students an opportunity to prepare. I'm not putting them on the spot like I would with a cold call. And I found that that really helps me to create a psychologically safe environment where students feel comfortable engaging in the case discussion. Deliverables and assessment, we've talked about a little bit. There are lots of different ways that you can take that, but I would say that cases are one of the more AI resistant methods. I don't know if they're AI proof, but I will tell you that I get much better engagement from students with those video deliverables that I mentioned, where they just record a quick little video log, essentially using Microsoft Teams. And that way I'm able to verify that they have hit the learning objectives that I wanted for the case. And I'm also not worried about it being an inauthentic form of assessment, or maybe they've been using AI when I didn't want them to. Feedback from students. So I always view case teaching and case writing kind of the same way. It's a cycle. I'm always looking for ways to improve, and I would encourage you to leverage your students in that regard. Oftentimes, if you want to know if a case worked well or didn't, the best way to know is to ask your students, did you enjoy the case? You can do this at your end of semester survey. I oftentimes will just do it in the week following the case discussion. I'll let students know I'm thinking about either keeping this case for next semester or replacing it with a different one. And what did they think about the case? What were the strengths? What were the weaknesses? If you're wanting to improve your case teaching, I would also encourage you to invite another faculty member who you trust to come sit in on one of your case teaching sessions. Having someone sitting at the back of the classroom who can actually watch you and provide feedback is a really great way to identify what worked as part of your case teaching style, and perhaps those areas where you can improve for next time. All right, next slide, Melissa. Okay, so to wrap things up, case teaching is lots of things, and it is very, very near and dear to my heart. The reasons for this: case teaching, it's approachable. I believe that it's a method that any faculty member and any student can learn to appreciate. So I find it very approachable. I also think that case teaching is adaptable. I'm a business professor, but I also know faculty who teach with cases in biology, kinesiology, lots of different disciplines. So it's a method that works really well across disciplinary boundaries. It's also engaging and active. I still remember the first time that I taught with a case, and I had students get so energized that they were standing up and literally shouting to have their point of view heard. And I thought, wow, this is something really magical that I just can't replicate with anything else. Case teaching is also effective in linking theory and practice. So I'm a super theoretical person. My students are not. They want to know the practical implications of these silly theories that we have. And I found that case teaching is a really good way to get them to see in the real world how these theories have played out. And then the last piece that I want to close with today, case teaching is awesome because it's also supported by a community of scholars and also partner organizations like Emerald and the Case Journal. So Melissa, if you could just click to this last slide. The Case Association is the partner of the Case Journal. And our mission I've included for you here, along with our website and a couple of photos of some of our recent conferences. And I would like to close today's presentation just with an invitation for anyone who's interested in learning more about case teaching or case writing as a research method to please reach out to us and consider getting involved. I don't know if you can see those smiles on everyone's faces, but we really have a lot more fun than we probably should. And it's given me a network of people that if I need to pick up the phone and say, I'm looking for a case on this topic, have you heard of one? Or I'm running into this question about this case or this way to teach it. What are your thoughts? For me, I have found not just a teaching method that I love and a research methodology that I love, but a group of people who I love dearly as well. So if anyone is interested in getting involved, please come find us on our website. And then the last slide, Melissa, just has my LinkedIn information. If anyone wants to reach out, please feel free. And that's all I've got.
Okay, thank you so much, Sarah. That was a great presentation, and I think it had some really clear and direct and practical advice for folks to use. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen for a sec, so we can move into the Q&A portion. Oops, hopefully that has gone away now. Cool. So a couple of folks have already sent in questions, but before we get started, I'll just give another plug to say, if you haven't, please do make use of the question panel. You can write directly to us and we will go through them in order and get to as many as we can. While you were talking pretty early on, we did get one question about subject areas that I just want to explain a little bit. So someone asked, is it just business cases essentially that Emerald provides? And I can handle this one, Sarah, if that's okay. The short answer is yes, our case collection is focused specifically on business teaching cases. That is our specialty in the case journal and our other outlets. We do have research journals separate from this collection that will have content such as research cases. We even have some medical cases over there, but those are not materials that are going to have this instructor's manual or teaching note, or that would really be, built and designed to be used in a classroom setting. So you're welcome to look further into those, but at TCJ in the case journal, it's only going to be those business teaching cases that we have. So moving on, we did get some other questions. So we had some interest come up when you were talking about online cases and how you were delivering those with a video element. So Alicia has asked, for the video deliverables, how do you ensure that students aren't reading from ChatGPT or a script in real time, or that they have not gone there prior to making the video? So perhaps you could expand.
Ooh, interesting. So my experience has been, I can tell kind of the verbiage if they've been using an AI model, but I've not yet encountered a situation like that where I suspected that a student was taking the time to write out a script and read it. But I will tell you that one thing I require in the instructions for those deliverables is they can't be reading anything. So they have to be presenting naturally. And if I start watching their video and I can clearly see that they're looking at something or just reading from their computer screen, I'll enter a 0 and reach out to them and ask them to re-record it. But that happens very, very minimally.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And just while we're on the note of online presentations of cases, when you are selecting a case specifically for online use, and some do have sections where they will say advice for the online format, some don't, how do you make the decision that a case is specifically good for the online format?
Ooh, I love this question. Okay, and I'm going to kind of approach this from my experience. So a lot of the online teaching that we do at my institution is asynchronous. So I do not actually get to engage with the students in real time. So in that setting, if I'm trying to find a case, I'm really looking for one that I know is going to give students enough information to where they can process through some of the basic questions on their own. So like I might tackle a more difficult case or one that maybe has what we'll call red herrings, where the author has inserted something in the case to kind of get students to follow this rabbit trail that's leading them down the wrong path. I would not pick that type of case to use in the online environment. Those cases are really fun when I'm there in person and can kind of steer the students back. But I think I would be a little bit apprehensive that they might follow that red herring and go a little too far down the rabbit hole in the online space. So to answer your question, I will say that I've stuck with kind of more straightforward cases in the online environment.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. I think that's helpful and good advice. So we've got another question that is, I think, more of a publisher's realm of responding. So my institution does not have a subscription to TCJ. Is there a way I can access these cases, essentially? And yes, if your institution is not subscribed to Emerald's case collection, the case journal is actually available via the Case Center. They are an aggregator, and they do have individual purchase options for all of our cases. So you don't need access to the full journal. You can just go through there and get the one you're looking for. If you're interested in subscribing overall, please do reach out to a member of the Emeralds team, and we'll be able to initiate those conversations with your business librarian so that you can have access to the entire collection. So hopefully that answers that person's question. We do have
if I could add, also coming from an institution that does not have access to a lot of the subscription databases and things like that, don't be afraid to write your own cases. So that was actually how I fell into case writing. I teach HR, and I think HR is one of those topics where we talk about terminations and performance improvement plans and sexual harassment and a lot of things that companies generally aren't going to necessarily be willing to talk about. So for me, that was why I started writing cases, was to have access to resources that I could use in my classroom. So if you are unable to find access to a case, don't be afraid to write your own.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. And likewise, if you have questions about authorship, we do these webinars fairly regularly, and we'll be doing one again in November on authorship. So feel free to reach out to get that registration information if you'd like to learn more on that front. We've got another question here from Daniela, who is teaching accounting courses. And Daniela says, I am sometimes struggling with the balance between technical aspects, such as cash flow statements or other calculations of accounts, and the bigger picture of decision making. How do you emphasize the importance of accuracy while not scaring students away from cases? I tend to provide a lot of guidance for the technical stuff, but my colleagues feel that this should be expected from them, and should be marked down if not accurate.
You know, that's a tough one. And I would say do what's best for your students. So your colleagues might feel one way, but depending on the group of students that you have, if your students need more of the technical details, that's fine. Help them with that. I think one thing to think about is you might teach the same case in the fall semester right now and have one experience and require one set of pre-work for students and experience a set of questions during the discussion. And then you could teach it again a year from now and have a different group of students and get an entirely different experience out of that. Maybe those students don't need as much of the quantitative kind of technical background piece. But I do think a lot of that comes from the nuance of figuring out, like the first thing that we talked about, really making sure that the case that you select is appropriate for your students. And don't be afraid to lean on prereqs. So I do not teach accounting, my condolences, but I do teach compensation and benefits. And they see the numbers and they freak out. And so I think the more that you can maybe balance that tension, give them additional resources if they do need it, but then still keep them focused on the case decision. And I will say, I think you all are pretty lucky in accounting because I know that you have some specialty kind of niche journals that focus specifically on accounting cases. So you're in good hands.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely, we do. And thank you for that response. We actually have another follow-up question from Daniela on a different subject. Yeah. So would you generally have students prepare a SWOT or a pestle analysis to get them researching the company?
Ooh, yeah. So I think SWOT and pestle works well. I don't teach strategy. So a lot of times I'm less concerned about like the external forces that are going on unless it's germane to the case. Now, one thing fun that you can do, because at a certain point, my students get tired of doing SWOTs or pestles. And so another thing that you can consider is you could take the company and the industry that it's in and maybe have your students find a similar company in the same industry in their local area. You could also have them, if you didn't want to have them do a SWOT and a pestle, you could have them do like a compare and contrast. You could have them research the company's competitors. But I think a full SWOT and pestle analysis would really only be required if that was part of the learning objectives of the case, which we do see a lot with strategy cases. I just don't teach those.
Mm-hmm. Cool, thank you. We've had a couple folks also asking about the slides and whether or not they'll be shared after the presentation. Yes, they will be shared afterwards. So I mentioned the recording will be shared a couple of hours later after we close down today's session. It just takes a little bit to organize itself, but you will receive that email under whichever account you registered with. And then I'm just scrolling through, we just got a bunch of new questions. We have some interest in Jill in finding cases on AI and ethics, and it sounds like Jill is looking for suggestions on these topics. I can chime in a little bit, Sarah. Okay. So we do publish on both of those areas, and I believe that TCJ has published just this year a couple on both AI and business ethics. So if you look on Emerald's website, you should be able to filter by the subject areas, and ethics is one of those. Or you can use the keyword search filter and put in AI, and it should pop up a list of recently published cases. But Jill, if you wanted to actually just write me an email, I'd be able to pull some recent suggestions on cases we published that you could take a look at. And I'm happy to help you with that. Just reading through quickly. So we've gotten a couple of questions from Alicia. Alicia says, I'm entirely new to cases and case teaching, working in the biomedical engineering space. So are there any resources you can recommend for case teaching and reviewing 101?
Yeah, I feel like this is another TCJ answer. So yes, there are lots of great resources. Melissa can probably point you towards the specifics, but when I have people who reach out to me and say like, hey, I think I want to get started with this whole case thing, I kind of have a list. And actually, Melissa, I can send these to you and you can distribute them. But one of the previous editor-in-chiefs, Rebecca Morris of the Case Journal, did a series of editorials that were published in TCJ that covered everything from how to teach cases in the classroom, how to use the IM, like that's another thing that I think might get lost. And so she has lots of great resources, not just for case writing, but a lot for case teaching as well. I will say, I'm not sure if Rebecca's book, the one on compact cases that you mentioned at the start, I don't know if that gets into case teaching because I haven't read that. But there is another book by Bill and Peggy Gnomes, and I can send you the citation for it, Melissa, as a way to get started. The third way would be to start coming to conferences. I just got back. Melissa and I were at a case conference in Orlando last week. The Case Association holds their conference in May. But then you can kind of get yourself embedded in this group of people who are all passionate about the same thing. And it goes beyond disciplinary boundaries. So I know that we've talked a little bit about business cases. Last week, I co-chaired one of the tracks at the conference. My co-chair is an industrial engineer. So she actually isn't in business, but she has also leveraged the case teaching in her classroom. So there's lots of great resources, and I'll send some to Melissa, and feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions.
That would be great. Thank you, Sarah. And I'll just add, I mentioned earlier the Cases Hub, where we house a lot of resources at Emerald. We do have a full course on teaching cases meant to help you become more confident going into lessons that will walk you through, similar to what Sarah has covered today, these different steps of just getting yourself ready. There's also a number of other webinars there. And just to tie this into some other questions I've seen coming through about authorship, we also have a course on writing a case study that will walk you through the entire process, from deciding what you want to write about, setting learning objectives, all the way through to you've got a draft, you're ready to start reviewing it to send out to publishers. And that Cases Hub is completely free. All you need to do is register an account and you'll be able to gain access to all of those resources. You can be faculty members, students can use it, anyone really who's interested in cases can use the Cases Hub. But with that being said, we have 1 minute left, so I'm afraid I'm going to have to wrap up this Q&A. Thank you so much again for your time and your experience, Sarah. I'd like to give you this last minute to share any closing thoughts you might have with the room.
I guess my only closing thought would be, don't be afraid. When I was really new to case teaching, I was afraid of things like going off the rails. I liked keeping lecture very constrained. And I don't think that's how students learn these days. And I can almost guarantee you that you will benefit from the experience as well. My life is enriched in a million different ways, teaching, research, and again, community and collaboration. So don't be afraid to get involved.
Okay, thank you so much. And if we did not get to your question, I'll pick up with you in the days to come. So just look out for a response from me. But hour exactly. So I will let everyone return to their days, and thank you so much for joining us.
Bye.
Have a good one. Bye.